Good morning, everyone. As you have heard, thank you for the introduction. I'm Alexander from CISPA, and I'm also presenting this talk on behalf of my co-authors, Jussi and Sven, who unfortunately cannot be here today. We have a lot to talk about, and if you were listening to the keynote a few minutes ago, I can promise you this will be something completely different. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the power of words. I will start with some general ideas that hopefully clarify why it is meaningful to talk about the things you're going to hear about in the next 12 minutes. And we start with messages in general. So when you hear messages, at this conference you might usually think about something like distributed computing or something technical maybe. But some of the most relevant messages in our everyday lives are sent, received, and decoded between humans. Like in these two examples, we either talk face-to-face or at least mediated through some kind of device to another person. This form of communication is characterized by the exchange where senders and receivers are clear and both can interact with each other. Even when there are conflicts in the decoding of the messages, the parties involved could resolve them by exchanging more messages, at least in theory. However, we also have come with a lot of ways to leave messages for others behind, without a specific receiver in mind. We share stories, we share video and audio, we share bare bones minimum information in the form of signs. And all of these can only be decoded correctly if the anonymous receiver is familiar with the codes of the sender. For example, the same word might be used differently in different communities. Unsurprisingly, these problems also translate to the smartphone app ecosystem. A lot of stakeholders leave many messages to be received and decoded by the end user. Today, I want to share with you some insights on a rather small but important part of these messages left behind, which are permission rationales that accompany requests for runtime permissions. Permission rationales usually come in a rather harmless disguise of being one dialogue of seemingly easy to decode text. They can be roughly broken down into text, design, timing, and timing. Text is what I'm going to talk about today, just because we call the paper also the power of words. For design, please refer to the paper itself, and for the timing, I recommend looking into the previous research in the footnote, which was conducted by my colleagues. Speaking of the text of rationales, there are already several recommendations available that aim to help developers set the tone of their rationales. These are already good starting points for developers. However, following these guidelines is not mandatory, and developers also do not choose from a predefined selection of phrases to build their rationale. Therefore, it is hard to evaluate what's actually going on in the real world. So in consequence, the first question we asked ourselves was, why does it skip slides? How do developers actually ask for runtime permissions? The decoding of any message can go very wrong, especially if we have no option to verify its content. Let's imagine the same app asking...
Give me 1 second.
Can I continue?
Yes, please.
All right. So, as I said, the decoding of any message can go very wrong, especially if we have no option to verify its content. Let's imagine the same app asking for the camera permission in these two ways. The upper one addresses the problem of the missing runtime permission. The lower one might be perceived as more friendly, specific, and gives additional guarantees. Objectively, it shouldn't make a difference, right? Because the consequences of accepting the permission request are exactly the same. But still, maybe you might prefer one of these messages over the other. Let's consider another example from a study investigating the so-called framing effect. The messages you see only differ in one aspect, which is not this one, but this one. In the upper one, the early bird registration is called the discount, while in the lower one, the late registration is called a penalty. The authors looked at whether the framing of these messages would make a difference in the number of early registrations. And indeed, as you already saw due to the slide skipping, more PhDs registered early when the price difference was framed as a penalty. Furthermore, faculties were not subject to the same difference. Apparently,
just say next slide if you want to do that.
okay. Apparently, the two messages with exactly the same monetary outcome had different behavioral outcomes depending on phrasing and receiver. Next slide, please. Coming back to permission rationals, this leads to our second question: how does rational phrasing impact users' decisions and experience? Next slide, please. Let's look at what we did to answer these questions and the answer to the first one. Next slide, please. The study we conducted is divided into a qualitative part and a quantitative part, where the second part builds on the insights of the first part. We continuously crawled the top 50 Play Store apps in every category between late 2021 and early 2022, leading to almost 9,500 investigated apps after selecting only those requesting at least one runtime permission. Next slide, please. It's an animation. There will be lots of next slide, please, in the next few minutes. Yeah, maybe you just go to last slide. Yeah, no, just one before that. Thank you. Combining several static and dynamic analysis techniques, we extracted over 35,000 rational sentences on over 1,000 screenshots to analyze their design. Random subsets of these were then manually coded until data saturation, which means that selecting new rationals from the pool did not provide new information. Ultimately, we kind of reverse engineered a recipe of how developers create their rationals. We then used these building blocks to create 320 unique rationals that we tested in a user study with 960 participants from 31 different countries. Let's have a look at the rational phrasing recipe, and you can also skip to the last slide of the animation, which is when the sentence at the bottom appears. Thank you. All right. The rational is divided into a main sentence, which exists in all rationals, and auxiliary information. The main sentence varies in 5 aspects: the perspective, which means whether the rational speaks from the viewpoint of the app or demands an action from the user; politeness, which is self-explanatory; the permission that is requested, whether it has a gain framing, that means you gain a functionality if you accept it, or a loss framing, which means you lose the functionality if you reject the permission request. And finally, the functionality is either described very specific or rather vague. The additional information, which were only present in a few rationals, range from linking more information to guarantees to not misuse the user's data. Let's look if it works now. Oh, still skipping. If we look at how those variations were distributed in a sample, you see that there are some preferred patterns which kind of align with the recommendations of the guidelines. However, looking at only the top apps of each category, there's already a lot of variance in how developers phrase their rationals. If you think back to the early registration example, that means that some of these rationals might have a very different impact on users depending on the permission, depending on the circumstance and on the users, despite being related to the very same runtime permission. Oh. Again, so far we've talked about framing. Maybe I just skip it and we go to the results of the user study. On the left, we see the granting decision only the rarely used additional building blocks, a guarantee to not misuse the data and to be able to revoke the permission later, increase the likelihood of granting the permission. Privacy concerns and experience with privacy incidents decrease it. But interestingly, also being polite from the app's perspective decreased the likelihood of granting the permission. On the right side, skip it. On the right side, we see what contributed to the feeling of having made an informed decision. As we will also see in the next slides, the granting decision itself is a substantial predictor of the user experience. With this, why this is the case in this sample is unfortunately unclear because it wasn't part of the study. Besides additionally providing more information and guaranteeing to not misuse the data, the specificity of the main sentence increases the perception of feeling well informed. And it skips again. People with privacy concerns are more satisfied with the decision, while prior experience with privacy incidents lowered the satisfaction. Concerning the building blocks, being specific increased satisfaction, while providing a positive gain framing decreases the satisfaction. On the right hand, you see that participants only felt in control when they were promised that their data would not be misused and that they could change their decision later, while prior experience with privacy incidents decreased the feeling of being in control. Let's have a quick summary of what you saw on the previous pages. The granting decision has a large effect on the perception. In terms of single building blocks, the effects were significant but rather small. However, a single building block can never meaningfully exist alone. Given that we found no indication of interactions of all positive and negative effects should just add up in a real-world sentence. Finally, privacy concerns and prior experience can easily nullify the positive effects of several building blocks. That means user concerns should always be addressed with proper additional information. Based on our findings, our advice to developers is the following. Be specific, but phrase it negatively. And don't skip slides. Okay, just tell you, assure users what the permissions will not be used for. Highlight the reversibility of permission decisions and provide supplemental information. Let's conclude with the answers to our initial questions. If you want to know how developers phrase rationals, you cannot just turn to the guidelines. There are a lot of things that are ignored or just not applied in the real world. However, these differences between rationals most likely affect everyday permission granting decisions. According to our results, even the most trustworthy app developer could fail acquiring runtime permissions by not addressing the user's concerns in their rationale. But there's still a lot to do. Our investigation merely marks a starting point, namely that we can be sure that even smallest linguistic variations can have an effect on users in terms of the security decision. Like in the example with the early bird registration, there might be much more personal or contextual factors determining how a rationale is perceived. There might be even building blocks that are much more influential than the ones we have tested but are not yet used in real apps. Okay, thank you. It's not working, but maybe it's working. That are much more influential than the ones we tested but are not yet used in real apps, so we don't know them. We need to figure out how to transfer this advice to developers, and given the implications that small text can change serious decisions, we must also think about how we make sure that apps adhere to their promises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
It was an interesting ride.
Hopefully the rest of the session goes smoothly. Thanks to you. For questions, for example.
Use the mic.
Yes, please, if you can.
Behind.
If you can yell, that's fine. I know it's difficult to come.
Oh, I can certainly yell. But setting good precedent. Okay, hi, Scott, Rudy from the University of Tennessee. Really interesting work looking at those permissions. I was curious, as I was seeing your example of the camera permission, it was almost like the company was telling you what they were promising to do with your data, and except there's supposed to be other places they do that, right? Like in their, probably their use policy at the beginning. Did you ever compare what they were promising to do with, like, in their terms of use with what they were promising to do in these permissions, and look for any maybe disjoint things there where they might say in their terms of use that actually we can do whatever the heck we want with your data, even though here we're saying we're not going to?
Yeah, sure. I guess this is one of the interesting results that might be caused by that it's a vignette study and there's no real stakes. Yeah, it was a surprising fact that users actually liked the rationale more if there was some link to the privacy policy, but in our experiment there was no actual link, so the user couldn't verify the content of the privacy policy. And regarding the apps that provided such guarantees, it was not in the scope of the study.
It'd be interesting in future work to compare those, and it would also be interesting to maybe talk to some legal scholars. Do those app notifications create a legally binding contract with the app in the same way their policies do?
Yeah, agreed.
question. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Sean from the University of Notre Dame, and I was wondering if have you explored the capability of ARM to understand the rationale behind this, notification, and thus exploit it to like manipulate users' perceptions, like dark patterns or something?
We have used classifiers to extract rationals and also to kind of automatically pre-classify them. Unfortunately, I wasn't part of the research team at the time when that happened, so I would refer you to the paper to read more about that. We have written what we have done in the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can thank the speaker. Thanks, Alexander, again. And if you have more questions,